The rain hammered against the windows of the military base cafeteria as Captain Sarah Martinez stood in line, her uniform slightly damp from the short walk between buildings. At 34, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that came from 15 years of military service, though few people at this new base knew her story. She had requested the transfer to camp after her promotion, wanting a fresh start where her reputation wouldn't precede her. Sarah had grown up in a small town in Texas, the daughter of a single mother who worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table. Joining the Marines at 18 wasn't just about serving her country. It was about survival, about creating a life where she wouldn't have to worry about whether the lights would stay on or if there would be dinner that night. She had clawed her way up through the ranks, earning respect through competence and determination rather than connections or politics. The cafeteria was crowded with the usual mix of personnel, young recruits still adjusting to military life, seasoned sergeants grabbing quick meals between training sessions, and officers engaged in quiet conversations over coffee. Sarah preferred to eat alone when possible, using the time to review reports or simply decompress from the demands of command. She had learned early in her career that being a woman in the military meant constantly proving herself, and she had developed strategies to navigate the complex social dynamics while maintaining her authority. As she moved through the line, selecting a simple meal of grilled chicken and vegetables, Sarah noticed a group of Marines at a corner table. They were loud, their conversation punctuated by bursts of laughter that carried across the room. She recognized the type, young, confident, and probably still riding the high of completing advanced training. She had been like them once, though perhaps never quite so carefree. The leader of the group was obvious even from a distance. Staff Sergeant was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that naturally drew attention. At 28, he had built a reputation as one of the most promising non-commissioned officers in his unit. He was known for his tactical skills, his ability to motivate troops, and his unwavering confidence in high-pressure situations. What he was also known for, though less officially, was his traditional views about military hierarchy and his skepticism about rapid promotions that he felt hadn't been properly earned. Came from a military family. His father had served in Vietnam, his grandfather in World War II. For him, the Marines weren't just a job. They were a calling, a sacred institution that demanded respect and adherence to time-honored traditions. He believed that leadership should be earned through years of service and proven competence in the field, not through what he sometimes dismissively referred to as political correctness or diversity initiatives. Sarah paid for her meal and looked around for an empty table. The cafeteria was fuller than usual due to the weather, and most tables were occupied. She spotted one near the windows that had just been vacated and made her way over, setting down her tray and removing her cap. She had planned to use this time to review the training schedules for the next week, but first she needed to eat something substantial. She had been up since 4:30 that morning, overseeing a complex training exercise that had run longer than expected. As she settled into her seat and opened her tablet to review documents, Sarah was only peripherally aware of the conversation at the nearby table growing louder. And his team were discussing their recent performance evaluations, and the conversation had turned to complaints about what they perceived as unfair advantages given to certain personnel. "I'm telling you it's not about merit anymore," was saying, his voice carrying clearly across the space between tables. "They're promoting people just to check boxes, not because they've put in the work or proven themselves where it matters." His companions nodded in agreement, emboldened by their leader's confidence and the relative privacy they thought their corner table provided. They had no idea that the woman sitting alone nearby had not only put in the work, but had proven herself in ways that would humble any of them. Sarah heard the comments but chose to ignore them, focusing instead on her tablet screen. She had heard similar sentiments throughout her career, sometimes whispered behind closed doors and sometimes expressed more boldly by those who felt protected by group dynamics or hierarchy. She had learned that engaging with such comments rarely led to productive outcomes, especially in social settings where emotions and pride could escalate quickly. The young Marines continued their discussion, their voices growing more animated as they fed off each other's frustration. They talked about specific cases they had heard about, promotions they felt were undeserved, and changes in military culture that they believed were weakening the institution they loved. None of them noticed that their conversation was attracting glances from other tables, or that the woman nearby had quietly closed her tablet and was now listening more carefully to their words. Leaned back in his chair, confident in his opinions and secure in the support of his teammates. He had served with distinction in 2 combat deployments, had received commendations for his leadership under fire, and was respected by both his superiors and subordinates. In his mind, this gave him the authority to speak about military standards and the direction the service was heading. "What really gets me," he continued, "is when someone gets fast-tracked through the ranks without ever proving themselves in real situations. You can't learn leadership from a textbook or a diversity seminar. It takes time, experience, and the respect of the people you're supposed to lead." Sarah's jaw tightened slightly, but she remained focused on her meal. She thought about her own journey, the years spent earning the trust of her Marines, the sleepless nights spent studying for advancement exams, the combat situations where her quick thinking and steady leadership had saved lives. She thought about the men and women who had served under her command, who had followed her orders without question because they trusted her competence and commitment to their welfare. The conversation at the nearby table showed no signs of quieting down. If anything, the Marines seemed to be gaining momentum, each comment building on the last, creating an echo chamber of frustration and resentment. Other diners had begun to take notice, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats, others exchanging glances that suggested they recognized the problematic nature of what was being discussed so openly. Stood up to get more coffee, and as he passed by Sarah's table, he glanced down at her dismissively. She was clearly an officer based on her uniform, but he didn't recognize her and assumed she was probably new, possibly in some administrative role that kept her away from real military operations. His assumption was based on her appearance. She was smaller than most of the Marines he worked with, and her clean uniform suggested she spent more time in offices than in the field. When he returned to his table, felt emboldened by what he interpreted as the officer's lack of reaction to their conversation. In his experience, if someone outranked you significantly and disapproved of what you were saying, they would make it known quickly and decisively. The fact that she had continued eating quietly suggested to him that she either agreed with their sentiments or lacked the authority to challenge them. "I'm just saying," continued, his voice now slightly louder, "some people get promoted based on who they are rather than what they've done. And when that happens, it affects unit cohesion and operational effectiveness. The Marines aren't a social experiment, they're a fighting force." Sarah finished her meal methodically, each bite requiring more effort as she listened to the continued commentary. She was accustomed to proving herself repeatedly, to facing skepticism about her capabilities, and to navigating situations where her authority was questioned or undermined. But something about this particular moment, this combination of assumptions and dismissiveness, was testing her usual patience. The rain continued to beat against the windows, creating a rhythmic backdrop to the tension that was slowly building in the cafeteria. Other diners had begun to finish their meals more quickly, sensing the uncomfortable atmosphere that was developing. A few senior non-commissioned officers had taken notice of the loud conversation and were exchanging concerned glances, but none had yet decided to intervene. Sarah gathered her things slowly, placing her tablet in her bag and preparing to dispose of her tray. She had originally planned to stay longer, to review more documents and perhaps make some phone calls related to upcoming training schedules. But the atmosphere had become too distracting, and she felt the familiar tension that came from having to constantly manage her reactions to situations that challenged her professionalism. As she stood to leave, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. Instead of simply walking away and letting the moment pass, she decided it was time to address the assumptions that had been made about her and the dismissive attitude that had been displayed. She had spent too many years proving herself to allow such comments to go unchallenged, especially when they reflected broader attitudes that affected not just her but every service member who didn't fit traditional expectations. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal truths, challenge assumptions, and demonstrate that leadership and competence could come from unexpected sources. What happened next would become a story that would be told and retold throughout the base, serving as a reminder that in the military, as in life, it was dangerous to judge people based on appearances or assumptions. Sarah walked toward the tray disposal area, her path taking her directly past the table where and his team continued their increasingly vocal discussion. As she approached, one of the younger Marines at the table made a comment that stopped her in her tracks. "Yeah, and half the time these diversity hires don't even understand basic military protocol. They get their rank, but they've never been tested where it counts." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, not because they were particularly harsh, but because they revealed assumptions that cut to the heart of every challenge she had faced in her career. She had been tested where it counted, more times than any of these young Marines could imagine, but their preconceptions prevented them from seeing her as anything other than what they expected her to be. Sarah paused, holding her tray, and turned slightly toward the table. "Excuse me," she said quietly, her voice carrying just enough authority to get their attention without creating a scene. The Marines looked up and, still standing near the table with his coffee cup, turned to face her. His expression was polite but dismissive, the kind of look one might give to someone who was interrupting a private conversation. "Yes, ma'am," said, his tone respectful but cool. He used the proper form of address for a female officer, but there was something in his delivery that suggested he was going through the motions rather than showing genuine respect. Sarah set her tray down on a nearby table and stepped closer to the group. She kept her voice calm and professional, but there was an unmistakable edge to her words. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation about promotions and qualifications. I was wondering if you might share what specific experiences you believe are necessary for effective military leadership." The question caught off guard. He had expected either a reprimand for being too loud or perhaps some administrative concern about their discussion. Instead, she seemed to be engaging with the substance of their conversation, which suggested she might actually agree with their perspective. "Well," began, settling back into his confident tone, "I believe effective leadership comes from hands-on experience, from proving yourself in challenging situations, and from earning the respect of the troops you're supposed to lead. It takes time to develop those qualities." His teammates nodded in agreement, and one of them added, "You can't learn real leadership in a classroom or get it just because someone thinks the unit needs more diversity." Sarah listened carefully to their responses, noting the assumptions embedded in their words and the confidence with which they spoke about military experience and qualifications. She had faced similar attitudes throughout her career, but rarely had she encountered such open discussion of these beliefs. "That's interesting," Sarah replied thoughtfully. "What would you consider to be the most important types of challenging situations for developing leadership skills?" Warmed to the topic, interpreting her questions as validation of his views. "Combat experience is obviously crucial," he said, "but also leading troops in high-stress training scenarios, making quick decisions under pressure, and handling personnel issues. You need to understand what your Marines are going through because you've been there yourself. And you believe these experiences are more valuable than, say, advanced military education or specialized training programs?" Sarah asked, her tone remaining conversational. "Absolutely," replied without hesitation. "I've seen too many officers who look good on paper but can't handle real situations. Book learning is fine, but it's no substitute for actual experience." As the conversation continued, other diners in the cafeteria had begun to take notice. Several senior personnel had stopped eating and were listening to the exchange, sensing that something significant was developing. The rain outside had intensified, creating an almost dramatic backdrop to the unfolding scene. Sarah nodded thoughtfully at its responses, as if considering his perspective carefully. "So you would say that someone's effectiveness as a leader should be judged primarily by their field experience and the respect they've earned from their subordinates?" "Exactly," said, feeling vindicated by what he interpreted as her understanding of his position. "It's about proving yourself through actions, not getting promoted because of politics or quotas." "I see," Sarah said quietly. "And how do you typically determine whether someone has that kind of experience and earned respect? What would you look for?" Gestured broadly, confident in his expertise on the subject. "You can usually tell pretty quickly how they carry themselves, how they talk about military operations, whether they understand the real challenges of leadership. It's obvious when someone has been tested and when they haven't." The conversation had drawn the attention of nearly everyone in the cafeteria by this point. Staff Sergeant Williams, a senior NCO who had been eating lunch nearby, recognized Sarah and had begun to look increasingly uncomfortable. He knew what didn't, that he was about to make a serious mistake. Sarah continued to ask questions, drawing out more details about his views on military leadership and qualifications. With each response, he became more confident and more explicit about his beliefs regarding promotions and the standards he felt should be applied. His teammates, emboldened by their leader's apparent success in the discussion, chimed in with supporting comments and examples. "The problem is," one of them said, "people get promoted nowadays without ever having to prove they can handle real responsibility. They check the right boxes, but they've never actually led Marines in situations that matter." Sarah listened to each comment with apparent interest, occasionally asking follow-up questions that encouraged them to elaborate on their views. To observers who knew her, it was clear that she was systematically documenting their assumptions and beliefs, building a complete picture of their attitudes before revealing the truth about who she was and what she had accomplished. "That's fascinating," Sarah said, after listening to another round of comments about undeserved promotions and lowered standards. "So you believe that true military leadership can only be proven through specific types of experiences, and that it should be immediately apparent to someone with your level of expertise?" "That's right," said firmly. "Anyone who's really been tested knows how to recognize it in others. It's like a code. You either have it or you don't." Sarah nodded slowly, and for the first time her expression began to change. The polite interest was replaced by something harder, more focused. "I'm curious," she said, her voice taking on a different quality. "What code would you say I have?" The question caught off guard, and he looked at her more carefully for the first time since the conversation began. He took in her appearance, her smaller stature, her clean uniform, her relatively young face, and made the same assumptions he had been making all along. "Well," he said, his tone becoming slightly more condescending, "you seem like you're probably in some kind of administrative role, maybe logistics or personnel. Nothing wrong with that. The Marines need people in support positions, too." The silence that followed his words was deafening. Even the noise from the kitchen seemed to fade as the implications of what he had just said settled over the room. Staff Sergeant Williams closed his eyes and shook his head, knowing that had just crossed a line from which there would be no easy return. Sarah's expression remained calm, but there was a new intensity in her eyes that made several observers shift uncomfortably in their seats. She had given and his team every opportunity to recognize their assumptions and adjust their approach, but instead they had doubled down on their preconceptions and dismissive attitudes. "Administrative or personnel work," she repeated slowly. "That's your assessment of my qualifications and experience." Still not grasping the danger he was in, nodded confidently. "I mean, no offense, but it's usually pretty obvious when someone has real field experience. You develop a certain presence, a way of carrying yourself that comes from being in challenging situations." "And you don't see that presence in me," Sarah said, her voice now carrying a subtle warning that was too confident to notice. "Not really," he replied with a slight shrug. "But like I said, support roles are important too. Not everyone can be infantry." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah finally allowed a slight smile to cross her face. It wasn't a friendly expression. It was the smile of someone who had just been given all the ammunition she needed to make a point that would not soon be forgotten. "You're absolutely right," she said quietly. "Not everyone can be infantry. Some of us have to be something more." The moment hung suspended in the cafeteria air like the calm before a storm. Sarah's last words had carried a weight that even began to sense, though he still didn't fully understand what was happening. Around them, the other Marines had gone completely quiet, their meals forgotten as they watched the exchange unfold. Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out her military identification card. She held it up so could see it clearly, and his eyes widened as he read the information printed there. Captain Sarah Martinez, United States Marine Corps. But it was the additional information below her rank that made his face go pale. "Force reconnaissance," she said quietly, letting the words sink in. 3 combat deployments. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. Bronze Star with Valor, Purple Heart, Navy Commendation Medal with Combat V. She paused, watching as the blood drained from his face. "Should I continue, Staff Sergeant, or would you like to revise your assessment of my qualifications?" Stared at the ID card in shock, his confident demeanor crumbling as the reality of his situation became clear. Force reconnaissance was among the most elite units in the Marine Corps, and the decorations Sarah had just listed represented the kind of combat experience and leadership that he had claimed to value above all else. "Ma'am, he began, but Sarah held up her hand to stop him. "No, please, let me finish," she said, her voice remaining calm but carrying an unmistakable authority that filled the room. "You wanted to discuss the importance of field experience and earning respect through proven performance. Let's talk about that. She stepped closer too, and despite her smaller physical stature, her presence now dominated the space between them. My first deployment was to Helmand Province in Afghanistan. I was a second lieutenant, 23 years old, and I was tasked with leading a reconnaissance team deep into Taliban-controlled territory to gather intelligence for a major offensive operation. The cafeteria had become completely silent, except for the sound of rain against the windows and Sarah's clear, steady voice. Even the kitchen staff had stopped working to listen to what was unfolding in their dining area. On the second day of that mission, Sarah continued, we came under heavy fire from a well-fortified enemy position. My team was pinned down, and we had 2 Marines seriously wounded. The extraction point was 800 meters away across open ground, and we had no air support immediately available. Swallowed hard, beginning to understand not just who he was talking to, but the magnitude of his misjudgment. I made the decision to create a diversion, drawing enemy fire, while my team moved the wounded Marines to safety. I spent 45 minutes alone, under constant fire, using movement and superior positioning to keep the enemy focused on me rather than my Marines. Sarah's voice never wavered, but there was an intensity in her eyes that spoke of memories that would never fade. When the dust settled, every member of my team made it to the extraction point alive. The intelligence we gathered led to the successful capture of a high-value target and the disruption of a major weapons smuggling operation. For that action, I received my first commendation for valor. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the group. But perhaps you're right. Perhaps that was just luck. Let me tell you about Iraq. His teammates had shrunk back in their chairs, no longer making eye contact with anyone. They had realized that their leader had led them into a disaster, and they were hopping desperately that they might escape without individual consequences. During my second deployment, I was a first lieutenant serving as the executive officer of a force recon company operating in province. We were tasked with training Iraqi security forces while conducting counterinsurgency operations. One night, our forward operating base came under coordinated attack from multiple directions. Sarah's recounting was precise and matter-of-fact, but every word carried the weight of lived experience and hard-won knowledge. The base commander was injured in the initial assault, and several of our senior NCOs were either wounded or cut off from the command post. With the communication systems damaged and the situation deteriorating rapidly, I had to take command of the defense. The rain outside intensified, creating a backdrop that seemed to emphasize the drama of her story. Several officers had quietly moved closer to hear better, recognizing that they were witnessing something significant. For 6 hours, I coordinated the defense of that base with whatever communications I could establish. I reorganized scattered units, directed fire support, and coordinated with Iraqi forces to execute a counterattack that broke the siege. We held our position with minimal casualties and inflicted significant damage on the attacking force. She looked directly at as she continued. The next morning, the base commander, a lieutenant colonel with 22 years of experience, told me that my leadership had saved the lives of over 200 American and Iraqi personnel. For that night's work, I was awarded the Bronze Star with Valor device. Stood frozen, unable to speak or move. Every assumption he had made, every dismissive comment he had expressed, was being systematically destroyed by the reality of who he had been talking to and what she had accomplished. But maybe you think medals don't matter, Sarah continued, her tone never losing its professional calm. Maybe you believe that respect from subordinates is more important. Let me tell you about the Marines who served under my command. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. This is Corporal Jennifer. She was one of my team leaders in Syria. She had been written off by previous commanders as too small, too emotional, not suited for combat operations. Under my leadership, she became one of the most effective reconnaissance specialists in the theater. Sarah held up another photo. Staff Sergeant Michael. He came to my unit with discipline problems and a reputation for being difficult to manage. I spent time understanding his background, his motivations, and his capabilities. He became my senior team leader and is now a gunnery sergeant training the next generation of Force Recon Marines. The photos she showed weren't formal military portraits. They were candid shots of Marines in the field, dirty and exhausted, but clearly confident in their leader. These were the faces of people who had been led through the most challenging circumstances imaginable by the woman standing before them. "I could tell you about dozens more," Sarah said, putting the photos away carefully. "Marines who discovered capabilities they never knew they had because someone believed in them and pushed them to excel. Marines who followed me into situations where failure meant death because they trusted my judgment and my commitment to bringing them home safely." She stepped back slightly, giving space but not releasing him from the intensity of her gaze. "So when you talk about earning respect through proven performance, when you discuss the importance of field experience and tested leadership, you're talking about things I've lived every day for the past 15 years." The silence that followed was profound. Everyone in the cafeteria understood that they had just witnessed something extraordinary, not just a revelation of military experience, but in leadership itself. Sarah had dismantled assumptions not through anger or humiliation, but through the simple presentation of facts and the quiet confidence that came from genuine achievement. Staff Sergeant Williams finally stood up from his table and walked over to the group. He snapped to attention and rendered a sharp salute. "Captain Martinez," he said formally, "it's an honor to have you at camp, ma'am." Sarah returned the salute with crisp precision, and her acknowledgement of Williams seemed to break the spell that had held the room in silence. Other Marines began to stand and pay their respects, recognizing not just her rank, but the extraordinary record of service she had just revealed. But the confrontation wasn't over yet. Still stood frozen, struggling to process what he had learned and figure out how to respond to the complete demolition of his worldview. And Sarah wasn't finished making her point about assumptions, respect, and the true meaning of military leadership. As Staff Sergeant Williams and other Marines in the cafeteria paid their respects, remained frozen in place, his mind struggling to reconcile the woman standing before him with the assumptions he had held just minutes earlier. The confident leader who had been holding court with his teammates was gone, replaced by someone who looked like he might be physically ill. Sarah observed his reaction with the analytical mind of someone who had been studying human behavior under extreme stress for her entire career. She could see the internal battle playing out across his face, the struggle between his ingrained beliefs and the undeniable evidence of her qualifications and experience. "Staff Sergeant," she said quietly, her voice cutting through his internal turmoil, "I believe you had some thoughts about diversity hires and unearned promotions. Would you like to share them now?" Opened his mouth, but no words came out. His teammates sat in silence, their earlier bravado completely evaporated. They had gone from feeling like they were among friends sharing legitimate concerns to realizing they were complicit in a massive failure of judgment and military courtesy. "No," Sarah continued when failed to respond. "Then perhaps we should discuss what just happened here and what it teaches us about making assumptions." She began to pace slowly in front of the table, her movement controlled and purposeful. Every Marine in the room recognized the behavior. It was the way drill instructors and senior leaders moved when they were about to deliver a lesson that would not be forgotten. "You looked at me and made instant judgments about my capabilities, my experience, and my value to this organization," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly throughout the now silent cafeteria. "You did this despite my rank, despite the fact that you knew nothing about my background, and despite the military training that should have taught you better." She stopped packing and turned to face directly. "But here's what concerns me most, Staff Sergeant. Your assumptions weren't just wrong, they were dangerous. In combat, the kind of snap judgments you just demonstrated could get Marines killed." Finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Ma'am, I apologize. I made serious errors in judgment." "Yes, you did," Sarah agreed. "But I'm not interested in apologies right now. I'm interested in understanding how a Marine with your experience and responsibilities could make such fundamental mistakes in assessment and professional behavior." She gestured to the other Marines in the room, many of whom were still listening intently. "Everyone here just witnessed a failure of leadership, but not the kind you were discussing earlier. This wasn't about unearned promotions or diversity quotas. This was about a senior NCO allowing personal biases to cloud his judgment and failing to maintain the standards of respect and professionalism that the Corps demands." The weight of her words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Teammates were beginning to understand that their involvement in the conversation might have consequences beyond mere embarrassment. "Let me ask you something," Sarah continued, her tone shifting slightly to become more analytical. When you were discussing the importance of field experience and proven leadership, were you thinking about specific individuals, or were you making general statements about trends you believe you've observed? Struggled to find an answer that wouldn't make his situation worse. I was speaking generally, ma'am, about what I thought were broader issues in the Corps. But your general statements were based on specific assumptions about people, weren't they? Sarah pressed. You believed you could identify who belonged in leadership positions and who didn't based on your personal criteria and observations. Yes, ma'am, admitted reluctantly. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. And yet when faced with an actual test of your judgment, when presented with a real person to evaluate, you failed completely. So what does that tell us about the reliability of your assessment methods? The question hung in the air unanswered because everyone in the room already knew the answer. His confident claims about being able to recognize real leadership and earned experience had been exposed as meaningless when confronted with reality. Here's what I think happened, Sarah said, beginning to pace again. You created a mental image of what military leadership looks like, and you convinced yourself that anyone who didn't fit that image was somehow deficient. You confused familiarity with competence and mistook similarity for qualification. She stopped and faced the entire group at the table. But the Marine Corps doesn't belong to any one type of person, and leadership doesn't come in only one form. The moment you start believing that effectiveness can be judged by appearance, background, or conformity to your personal expectations, you stop being an effective leader yourself. The lesson was being delivered not just to and his teammates, but to every Marine in the cafeteria. Sarah had turned their mistake into a teaching moment that would resonate throughout the base community. I want you to think about something, Sarah continued, her voice taking on a more personal tone. Every Marine who has served under my command, regardless of their gender, their background, or their path to the Corps, had to meet the same standards of performance and dedication. They earned their place through merit, just as I earned mine. She paused, letting that sink in before continuing. But here's the difference between us, Staff Sergeant. When I encounter Marines I don't immediately understand or who don't fit my preconceptions, I take the time to learn about them before making judgments. I ask questions, I observe their performance, and I evaluate their character based on their actions, not their appearance. Nodded weakly, beginning to understand the depth of his failure and its implications for his future in the Corps. The Marine Corps has always been about transformation, Sarah said, her voice growing stronger. We take people from all walks of life and forge them into something greater than they were before. That process doesn't work if we allow prejudice and narrow thinking to determine who gets opportunities and who doesn't. She looked around the room at the other Marines who had been listening. Every person in this room has the potential to lead Marines in combat, to make life-and-death decisions under pressure, and to uphold the honor and traditions of our Corps. But that potential can only be realized in an environment where people are judged by their performance, not by whether they match someone else's expectations. The rain outside had begun to subside, but the atmosphere in the cafeteria remained charged with tension and the weight of the lesson being delivered. Sarah could see that her words were having the intended effect, not just on and his immediate group, but on everyone present. Now, she said, her tone becoming more businesslike, we need to discuss what happens next. Staff Sergeant, your comments today revealed attitudes that are incompatible with effective military leadership. More importantly, your failure to recognize and show appropriate respect to a superior officer represents a serious breach of military courtesy. His face went white as he realized that the confrontation was moving beyond embarrassment into the realm of formal consequences. His military career, which he had been so proud of just an hour earlier, was suddenly in jeopardy. Sarah studied his pale face and the expressions of his teammates, all of whom now understood that their casual lunch conversation had evolved into something with potentially career-ending implications. The silence in the cafeteria was complete, broken only by the diminishing sound of rain against the windows. However, Sarah continued, her tone shifting slightly, I believe that the most powerful lessons come not from punishment but from understanding and growth. Staff Sergeant, what did you learn from this encounter? Straightened slightly, recognizing that he was being given an opportunity to salvage something from the disaster he had created. Ma'am, I learned that my assumptions were completely wrong, and that I allowed personal biases to affect my professional judgment. I failed to show proper respect to a superior officer, and I demonstrated the kind of thinking that undermines unit cohesion and effectiveness. Sarah nodded approvingly. Continue. I also learned, said, his voice growing stronger as he found his footing, that true leadership comes in many forms, and that my narrow definition of what qualifies someone for command responsibility was not only wrong but dangerous to the Marines I'm supposed to serve alongside. And what will you do differently going forward? Sarah asked. Took a deep breath before responding. I will focus on evaluating people based on their actions and performance rather than my preconceptions about what they should look like or how they should behave. I will work to become the kind of leader who brings out the best in all Marines, regardless of their background. Sarah listened carefully to his response, evaluating not just his words but the sincerity behind them. She had seen many Marines face moments of reckoning throughout her career, and she had learned to distinguish between those who truly understood their mistakes and those who were simply trying to avoid consequences. That's a good start, she said finally. But understanding the problem is only the first step. Real change requires sustained effort and accountability. Staff Sergeant, you and your team will report to my office tomorrow at 800 hours. The announcement sent a ripple of tension through the group, but Sarah wasn't finished. You will spend the next month working directly with me on a special project. We're going to examine leadership development across different demographics within the Corps, and you're going to help me identify ways to ensure that all Marines have equal opportunities to develop and demonstrate their capabilities. Blinked in surprise. He had expected formal discipline, possibly even charges under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Instead, he was being given an opportunity to learn from his mistakes while contributing to solutions for the problems his attitudes had represented. This isn't a punishment, Sarah clarified, reading his expression. This is leadership development. You demonstrated today that you have strong opinions about military leadership and standards. I'm going to help you channel those opinions into constructive action that benefits the entire Corps. She turned to address the other Marines at the table. The same applies to all of you. You participated in a conversation that reflected problematic attitudes, but you also have an opportunity to be part of the solution. I expect each of you to think seriously about how you can become better leaders and more effective Marines. The transformation in the atmosphere was remarkable. What had begun as a potential disciplinary disaster was evolving into a learning opportunity that could benefit not just the individuals involved, but the entire military community. Sarah looked around the cafeteria at all the Marines who had witnessed the exchange. Let me say something to everyone here. Today you saw what happens when assumptions and biases go unchallenged. But you also saw what's possible when people are willing to confront uncomfortable truths and learn from their mistakes. She paused, making eye contact with different individuals throughout the room. The Marine Corps is stronger when we embrace the full range of talent and capability that exists within our ranks. That means creating an environment where people are evaluated fairly, where excellence is recognized regardless of its source, and where leadership is defined by competence and character rather than conformity to narrow expectations. Staff Sergeant Williams stepped forward again. Ma'am, speaking for the senior NCOs present, we want to support your efforts in any way we can. Today's lesson won't be forgotten, and we'll make sure the standards you've demonstrated become part of how we train and develop junior Marines. Sarah smiled for the first time since the confrontation began. Thank you, Staff Sergeant Williams. That's exactly the kind of leadership we need throughout the Corps. She turned back to and his team. I want to be clear about something. My rank and my record don't make me better than any of you as a human being. What they represent is the culmination of years of hard work, dedication, and the support of countless Marines who helped me develop into the leader I am today. Every one of you has the potential to achieve similar success if you're willing to put in the effort and remain open to learning. Found the courage to speak again. Ma'am, I want to thank you for handling this situation the way you did. I expected consequences for my behavior and I deserved them. Instead, you're giving me a chance to grow and contribute. I won't waste that opportunity. I believe you won't, Sarah replied. But remember, Staff Sergeant, true change is measured not by intentions but by actions. Show me and your fellow Marines who you can become. As the formal part of the encounter concluded, the normal sounds of the cafeteria began to return. Marines resumed their conversations, though the topics had clearly shifted to reflect what they had just witnessed. Several individuals approached Sarah to introduce themselves and express their respect for how she had handled the situation. And his teammates gathered their belongings quietly, still processing the magnitude of what had occurred. As they prepared to leave, turned back to Sarah. "Ma'am, one more thing. Earlier I said that anyone who's really been tested knows how to recognize it in others. I realize now how wrong I was about that. How should I have recognized your experience and qualifications?" Sarah considered the question carefully before responding. "Staff Sergeant, the answer isn't about developing better ways to judge people quickly. The answer is about approaching every interaction with respect, humility, and openness to learning. When you assume you can assess someone's worth in a few minutes based on surface observations, you're almost guaranteed to miss something important." She gestured around the cafeteria at the diverse group of Marines present. "Every person in this room has a story, experiences, and capabilities that might surprise you. The key to effective leadership is creating space for those stories to emerge and those capabilities to be developed and utilized." Nodded slowly, understanding that the lesson went far beyond military hierarchy or his personal mistakes. "Thank you, ma'am. I'll see you at 800 tomorrow." As and his team left the cafeteria, the other Marines began to disperse as well, but the conversations continued in small groups throughout the base for the rest of the day. The story of the confrontation spread quickly, but it wasn't told as a tale of humiliation or punishment. Instead, it became a story about leadership, learning, and the importance of challenging assumptions. 3 months later, Staff Sergeant would be selected for promotion to Gunnery Sergeant, based in large part on his work with Captain Martinez on leadership development initiatives that had been implemented throughout camp. The project they collaborated on became a model for other installations, helping to create environments where all Marines could thrive regardless of their background or the preconceptions others might hold about them. But the real impact of that rainy afternoon in the cafeteria wasn't measured in promotions or formal recognition. It was seen in the changed attitudes, the more inclusive leadership practices, and the growing understanding throughout the Marine Corps that strength comes from embracing diversity of thought, background, and experience, while maintaining the highest standards of performance and dedication. Captain Sarah Martinez had demonstrated that true leadership wasn't about proving superiority over others, but about creating opportunities for everyone to discover and develop their full potential. In doing so, she had shown that the most powerful victories are those that transform opponents into allies and mistakes into opportunities for growth. The rain had stopped, the sun was beginning to break through the clouds, and the Marine Corps was a little bit stronger than it had been that morning.